an artist create a world when her own world is enclosed within convent walls? On Florence's Via Cava, close to Piazza San Marco, the movement of the modern city passes over a vanished place. Here once stood the Dominican convent of Santa Caterina da Siena. Its buildings have disappeared, but the work created within them has begun slowly to return to view. In the mid-16th century, Florence was alive with artistic ambition. Commissions were negotiated in churches and in merchants' palaces. Workshops were crowded with the apprenticeships and the apprentices preparing the wooden panels and stretching the canvas, grinding the pigments and learning the closely guarded practices of their masters. A young woman could not simply enter one of these workshops and follow the same path. A woman couldn't join the professional life of the city on equal terms, or study the nude figure, or move freely between artists, patrons, and academies. Yet, within Santa Caterina, a Dominican nun named Sister Plautilla Nelli became the first documented woman artist of Florence. She led a workshop. She trained other women and created paintings that entered churches, convents, and the homes of Florentine patrons. Her greatest surviving work stretches almost 7 meters across the wall. It contains 13 life-sized male figures and carries in its upper corner a request at once humble and quietly assured. Sister Plautilla, pray for the women painter. Welcome to the Sunday Echo. I'm Kate Field. I'm an artist, a writer and a teacher with a lifelong curiosity about people and places and ideas that continue to speak to us across the centuries. And today we are entering the vanished convent of Santa Caterina and discovering the remarkable palette of Sister Plautilla Nelli. Plautilla was born in Florence in 1524 and baptized Polissina Margherita Nelli. Her father, Piero de Luca Nelli, was a prosperous cloth merchant, and her family belonged to the commercial life of Florence, a city in which textiles and banking and art were closely intertwined. Paintings required considerable material investment. The linen, the timber, the gold leaf, the pigments arrived through complex networks of trade. And, for example, a brilliant blue of ultramarine began as lapis lazuli, mined thousands of miles away. Now, even the materials of devotion carried within them the movement of these merchants, of ships and workshops and distant landscapes. Plautilla's mother died while she was still very young, and her father later remarried. In 1538, at the age of 14, Polissina entered the convent of Santa Caterina da Siena. Her sister Constanza also entered the community, taking the name Sister Petronilla. For the daughters of Florentine families, the possibilities available were usually shaped by marriage or the religious life. Both demanded a financial contribution from the family, although the dowry required by a convent was generally less costly than a socially advantageous marriage, shall we say. We can't know precisely how the 14-year-old Polissina felt as she entered Santa Caterina. Her family circumstances, her religious belief, and the expectations of the society around her all formed part of that decision. She took the name Sister Plautilla and began a life whose rhythm would be governed by the divine office. Communal meals, prayer, work, and the changing seasons of the church's year. From that time onwards, the greater part of her life was shaped by the physical and spiritual enclosure of the convent. Santa Caterina was a large and active community. By 1562, it was home to more than 100 women. Its spiritual life was profoundly influenced by the Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarello. I need to pronounce that again. Savonarola, that's what I meant. He was preaching in nearby San Marco and in the 15th century, calling Florence to repentance and condemning the luxury and corruption that he believed had overtaken the city. Savonarola remains a deeply complicated figure. He's associated with the bonfire of the vanities, in which paintings, books, mirrors, musical instruments, and other objects regarded as morally dangerous were burned in the streets of Florence. This is really upsetting to me. He was himself executed in the Piazza della Signoria in 1498. He also encouraged the creation of clear, emotional, direct religious art. Sacred images that could help ordinary people contemplate the life of Christ or the Virgin Mary and the saints. Drawing and painting were considered suitable forms of productive devotional activity within the communities of religious women of this time. Santa Caterina was founded by one of Savonarola's followers and remained closely connected to his spiritual legacy. Plautilla's sister Petronilla, later wrote an account of his life. And within this environment, art became part of the convent's devotional practice and its economic life. The sisters needed to support their large community. They undertook sewing and textile work, manuscript production, and other forms of skilled labour. Paintings could be given to benefactors and commissioned by patrons or sold to provide an income. The convent walls restricted Plautilla's physical movement and her access to the training available to male artists. They also enclosed a community of educated women with shared resources, practical skills, and a religious purpose. Plautilla's achievement grew within these quite complicated conditions. She received no conventional apprenticeship in Florentine's artist's workshop, for example. Her education as a painter developed through observation, through copying and sustained practice. An especially important resource was a collection of drawings by the Dominican artist Fra Bartolomeo. Fra Bartolomeo had been one of the leading painters of Florentine Renaissance. He was just quite extraordinary. And after his death, his drawings passed to his pupil, Fra Paolino. And when Fra Paolino died in 1547, a significant group of these studies came into Plautilla's possession. And these drawings gave her access to the private thinking of a professional artist. A finished painting can conceal the doubts and the revisions that preceded it, all those kind of messy bits. And a drawing often reveals them. The repeated line around a shoulder, the altered position of a hand, the head turned several times before the artist finds the gesture that feels true. We can imagine Plautilla unfolding these precious sheets and studying within the decisions held within them. She observed the tilt of the head, the weight of a kneeling body, and the gathering of cloth around a figure. And she copied the forms and gradually absorbed their visual language. Her surviving drawings show that she practiced the human figure within the confines of the convent, but with a seriousness and with a care. And she studied the work of artists, including Andrea del Sarto and Bronzino. Copying was an essential part of Renaissance artistic training, and it required the student to enter another artist's process, to follow the line and examine proportion and to understand how separate marks create the illusion of a living body. Plautilla built an artistic education from the resources that came to her, and over time she became a respected figure within Santa Caterina. She served as a prioress on 3 occasions, placing her at the head of the convent's spiritual, administrative, and economic life, which is, again, really quite extraordinary. It does tell us a little bit about her personality, because this changes the picture that we might hold of a solitary nun quietly painting in an undisturbed room. Plautilla carried responsibility for a substantial community. She managed practical affairs. She maintained relationships with patrons and helped guide the religious life of the sisters. Alongside this work, she developed and led a flourishing artistic workshop. Several of the women who worked with her are known by name, and they include Sister Prudenza Cambi, Sister Agata Trabalese, and Sister Maria Ruggieri. These women prepared and produced sacred images using the professional painting techniques of their time. Their work travelled beyond the walls of Santa Caterina, spreading the convent's devotional culture through Florence and further across Italy. Few of their individual contributions can now be identified, sadly. Workshop production was collaborative, and the reputation of the leading artist often absorbed the work of the assistants and the pupils. Women working in religious communities were particularly vulnerable to the kind of disappearance from the historical record. Yet, the survival of these names allows us a tiny little glimpse to the room, which I just think is absolutely amazing. Plautilla was surrounded by other working women, drawing, mixing colours, preparing surfaces, discussing images and learning through that shared practice. The convent contained a community of makers. Plautilla's reputation reached beyond Santa Caterina. Giorgio Vasari included her in the 1568 edition of his Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors and Architects. Women appear very, very rarely in Vasari's great history of Renaissance art, so her inclusion is really significant. He wrote that there were so many of Plautilla's paintings in the houses of Florentine gentlemen that it would be tedious to mention them all. This tells us something important. Plautilla was not producing pictures solely for private use within her convent. Her paintings circulated through the city and were known to wealthy collectors. Vasari praised her diligence and her ability, and his account also reveals the assumptions of his age. He observed that she would have achieved even greater things had she possessed the opportunity to study drawing and the human figure like the men. He's absolutely right. Women had little access to the study of anatomy or the nude model, both of which were absolutely central to Renaissance artistic training. Plautilla was judged according to standards built upon opportunities that she'd never been given. She continued, nevertheless, to paint ambitious groups of figures, including bodies on a monumental scale. Plautilla's most extraordinary surviving achievement, I think, is the Last Supper, painted during the 1560s for the refectory of Santa Caterina. The work is almost 7 meters wide and 2 meters high. It's huge. Christ and the 12 apostles appear life-size, gathered around a long table covered with a white cloth. It's the earliest known representation of the Last Supper painted by a woman. And it's perhaps the only surviving example created by a woman during the Renaissance. Florence possesses a remarkable tradition of Last Supper paintings. Ghirlandaio, Andrea de Castenago, Andrea de Santo. So many artists created monumental versions for the convents and for monastery refectories. And as members of a religious community, they all ate together, and they did so in the imagined presence of Christ's final meal with his disciples. The subject carries immense theological weight and demanded control of composition. It also demanded control of perspective and gesture and the male figure, and it was the kind of commission generally entrusted to an established male artist and his workshop. Plautilla claimed that space for herself and her community was important, and she wanted to do this. A work of this size requires considerable resources and physical effort. Vast length of canvas had to be prepared and supported. Large quantities of pigment and oil were needed. A full-sized composition had to be planned and then transferred and brought into a balance across the enormous surface. Plautilla led a workshop of artist-nuns, and it is highly probable that members of this community assisted with the painting's preparation and execution. We can't know which hands contributed to which particular areas. The work carries the visual authority of Plautilla's design and direction, together with possible presence of the other women that she trained. Standing before the restored canvas, the first impression is one of scale. 13 men occupy the space with physical presence. Their heads turn towards one another. Hands reach, point, question, and withdraw. Plautilla gives particular attention to hands. The tendons, the veins, the fingernails are carefully observed. Hands become part of the emotional language of the painting. The apostles respond to Christ's announcement that one of them will betray him. Their gestures carry uncertainty and alarm and grief and disbelief. Judas sits at the near side of the table, separated from the others by his position and carrying the purse associated with his betrayal. St. John leans close to Christ, overcome with sorrow. Plautilla's sacred figures possess an emotional directness found throughout all of her work. In her Lamentation with Saints, the mourners surrounding the dead Christ have reddened eyes and visible tears. Grief is shown as a physical experience held in the face and the body. Perhaps life within a community of women offered Plautilla a particular close understanding of shared emotion, the way that sorrow passes through a group, the impulse to support one another, and the eloquence of a hand placed gently on an arm or a shoulder. The table itself deserves careful attention. Upon the white cloth are bread, wine, and a roasted lamb, together with bowls of lettuce and fresh fava beans. The lettuce and beans are unusual. Scholars have found no early surviving Florentine Last Supper that also has these particular foods. They may connect the biblical meal with the regulated diet and Lenten practices familiar to the women of Santa Caterina. These were foods the sisters would have recognized from their own table. Plautilla brings the sacred event into the real material world of the convent. The meal belongs simultaneously to first century Jerusalem, Renaissance Florence, and the daily life of Santa Caterina. Small glass vessels catch the light. Folds run across the white linen. Food is distributed along the table with an attentiveness that suggests familiarity with the preparation and the sharing of the communal meals. The painting was created for women who would look at it while eating together. Its first audience knew the rhythms of that table. In the upper left part of the canvas, Plautilla placed her signature. S. Plautilla, orate pro pictora. Sister Plautilla, pray for the woman painter. This is believed to be her only surviving signed work. The wording is striking. Plautilla uses the feminine form, pictoria. She identifies herself explicitly as a woman who paints. The inscription belongs to the language of faith. It's a request for prayer consistent with the humility expected of a religious woman. It's also a clear declaration of authorship. Plautilla doesn't disappoint, and she doesn't disappear behind her convent, her workshop, or her subject. She places her name upon the painting of extraordinary scale and asks the viewer to remember the person who made it. Plautilla died in 1588. As artistic fashions changed, her reputation gradually faded. Paintings associated with her workshop were dispersed and neglected, or they were attributed to male artists. The absence of signatures and records made this process all too easy. The convent of Santa Caterina was suppressed during the Napoleonic period and later demolished. Its community was scattered, and the original setting of the Last Supper disappeared. In 1817, the painting was transferred to the Dominican complex of Santa Maria Novella, and it hung in the refectory before being moved again. Around 1911, it was removed from its stretcher, rolled up, and placed into storage, and it remained there for nearly 30 years. A restoration in 1939 returned it to view, and the painting survived the catastrophic Florence flood of 1966 with relatively limited damage. Later, it was moved into the friars' private quarters, where public access was restricted. For much of the 20th century, one of the largest surviving works by an early woman artist remained effectively invisible. The painting existed, yet it occupied the margins of the history told about Renaissance Florence. During the early 21st century, the work of the Advancing Women Artists Foundation brought renewed attention to Plautilla and other women whose paintings remained in Florentine collections and storerooms and cupboards. And the foundation supported the restoration of 21 works connected with Plautilla and her workshop. In 2015, The Last Supper entered a major conservation programme led by the restorer Rosella Lari. Funding came from supporters in 19 countries, and through an imaginative Adopt an Apostle campaign, individual donors helped to fund the restoration of each figure. For 4 years, conservators studied and treated the enormous canvas. Accumulated dirt, discoloured varnish, structural damage, and the effects of earlier interventions were carefully addressed. Colours emerged with renewed clarity. Details that had been difficult to see became visible again. There's a pleasing symmetry in this part of the story. A monumental painting created within a community of women was recovered through the work and generosity of another community centuries later. Women played leading roles in its conservation, in the scholarship and the return to public attention. In October 2019, Plautilla's Last Supper was placed on permanent display in the Museum of Santa Maria Novella. The painting had returned to a Dominican refectory, a short distance from the place where Plautilla and her sisters first sat beneath its figures. Plautilla's world was bounded by walls that she hadn't built and customs that she hadn't chosen. Within that world, she became a painter, a teacher, a prioress, and a leader of a community of working artists. She studied the drawings that reached her. She developed skills she had been denied and the formal means to learn. And she found her way through there. She worked on a scale few women of her century could have imagined. Her story asks us to think carefully about creative freedom. Complete freedom is a rare condition. Most creative lives develop within some form of limitation. That could be time or money or health or responsibility, geography or the expectations of others. Limitations can narrow what is possible, but they can also reveal the particular materials, the relationships, and the spaces that remain available to us. Plautilla found such spaces within Santa Caterina. Her faith gave purpose to her art. The convent community supplied knowledge and assistance and an audience. Her own discipline and intelligence transformed these resources into paintings capable of speaking far, far beyond their original settings. In one corner of her great canvas, she left a short request asking us to pray for the woman who painted it. Perhaps those words carry another request as well, that we should look carefully and remember her name and recognise the many hands whose work history allowed to disappear. The convent has gone. The painting remains. And after centuries of interrupted visibility, Sister Plautilla is present once more. Thank you so much for joining me for this edition of the Sunday Echo. If you're enjoying discovering the lives and ideas that continue to resonate across art, faith, and history, you are very welcome to subscribe to Quiet Wanderings and join me again next time. Take care. Bye-bye.